Everyone. My name is Kengo Segoyan, and I'm an executive committee member of the Armenian National Committee of America, Silicon Valley chapter. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome you all to our program, Uncorking the History of Wine. Today, we'll be discussing the writing of author, activist, and wine enthusiast Vahan Zanoyan. We'll be discussing his book, Waking Noah's Vines. We'll learn about the rich tradition of Armenian winemaking that has survived 6,000 years and is seeing a recent renaissance with increased production, development of character, and is garnering international interest. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Rafi Kasarjan, the CEO of Zanoyan, a consulting firm that works with companies investing or operating in Armenia. Rafi will be leading our discussion today. Cheers.
Thank you, Kengo, and welcome everybody. And I want to thank the Armenian National Committee for organizing this event. And for the, let's see, it looks like about 80 people have joined so far to spend the next hour or so on a Sunday afternoon together. First of all, I guess I should say the world and the US are going through some pretty difficult times as we've witnessed the last, couple of months and especially the last few days. So hopefully this will be a chance to think about some of the great things in life as we all struggle with some of the challenges that we're going through as a country and society. Now, as an avid wine drinker and an amateur historian, I am super excited to be part of this event today. We're going to spend the next hour talking about the origins of wine, where winemaking began, and then fast forward to some of the exciting things that are happening in winemaking in that same region 6,000 years later. And I'd like to start by introducing our guests. We're very excited to have some wonderful guests with us today. First, special thanks and welcome to my dear friend Hallie Buttman, who is Director of Special Projects at the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, and the curator of the Armenia Creating Home program at the 2018 Smithsonian Folk Life Festival. For those of you that had a chance to be in DC last year during the 4th of July week, it was an incredible setting in which we were able to celebrate the rich history of Armenia, including winemaking. As part of the Smithsonian Institution USAID program, Hallie and her team have worked hard to revive our artisanal traditions throughout Armenia as part of the country's focus on tourist development. And we always enjoy welcoming her to Armenia. And today, Hallie will be reading several passages from Vahan's book, Waking Noah's Vines. Welcome, Hallie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rafi.
We're also very honored to welcome Paul Hobbs to today's event. I had the pleasure of meeting Paul in Yerevan last year as part of the introduction for the Yakubian Hob wines. There was a special event there. He is a visionary international vintner, owner, and winemaker for California-based wineries Paul Hobbs and Cross Barn. In addition, Paul is involved in several international partnerships: Viña Cobos of Argentina, Crocus of Cahors, France, of course, Yakubian Hobbs of Armenia, and 2 projects in development, Alvaredo's Hobbs of Galicia, Spain, and Hillican Hobbs of the Finger Lakes. And I should also say he's the inspiration for one of the key characters in the book, and we'll learn more about that later. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for being with us today. And finally, I'd like to introduce our featured guest for today, Vahan Zanoyan. Vahan is the author of 4 novels. 2, A Place Far Away and The Doves of Ohanavan, are based on a chance encounter with a survivor of sex trafficking, a very heavy subject. His 3rd novel, The Sacred Sands, reflects his own experience as an international energy consultant. Before he retired, Vahan served as an advisor to governments, private organizations, and other major players in the fossil fuel industry. Now, I first met Vahan through his debut novels, and I should say, within the novels, his description of the Biozor region just grabbed me from the very beginning. And even more so, his description of the mountain layer of one of the main protagonists in the book sounded too vivid and too real to be a fictional place. And so sure enough, when I met Vahan for the first time at a charity dinner, I introduced myself. We quickly established that we knew a lot of the same people from Beirut, where he and I are both originally from. And I immediately invited myself to his mountain lair, saying, Vahan, I read these passages, they're so incredible, I have to come there. And thank goodness that, you know, this is very uncharacteristic of me. I'm never that assertive, especially when meeting somebody for the first time. Thank goodness he immediately said yes. And since then, we've had many long conversations over many bottles of wine, and which has been a great part of my life for the last few years. My wife Luciana and our lives. And finally, he's also occasionally given me the chance to give some nagging contributions to his creative process in the books that he's been writing. So Vahan, very excited to be doing this with you today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for spending Sunday afternoon with us. Thanks a lot, Rafi, for this wonderful introduction.
Okay. So we're going to talk about Waking Noah's Vines, and I'll just read a couple of phrases from the Kirkus Book's review of the book. A delightful fictional blend of history, suspense, and a love of wine. The author's ardor for wine is unmistakable and his knowledge impressively prodigious. The novel will intoxicate readers with its rare mix of historical astuteness, literary skill, and well-crafted drama. So Vahan, my first question is, you know, your first two books, Sex Trafficking, the third book about the international oil industry, the run-up to the first Gulf War, you know, very heavy subjects. What caused you to turn to something lighter? Sort of how did the core of the novel form in your psyche?
All right. First, like you said, the first two were really painful, both to research and to write and to do some of the interviews that I did. They were, I mean, I've spent maybe 2 years losing sleep over some of the issues. It was excruciating. The third wasn't that painful, the Sacred Sands, but it was heavy. It was the Gulf War, OPEC intrigue, international oil market intrigue, and so it was a serious subject. And I was definitely by then ready for something lighter, like you said, something more fun, especially something where I could enjoy doing the research. And so then I realized how far the wine industry in Armenia had come. Now, I had been there 31 years ago, earlier. There wasn't a single drinkable wine locally produced back then, okay? And it was still Soviet Union and so on. But even after independence, the first 20 years or so, there still wasn't any seriously drinkable wine made in Armenia. Then there was this incredible revolution. There was this rebirth, renaissance of wine that happened. And I couldn't barely keep up. I couldn't keep up. There were so many new wines coming on the market almost every week, every month. And so it was a lot of fun first being present when this revival was happening, and then it hit me. This is the next topic I'm looking for. So I focused all my energies and I increased, of course, research, in quotes, entitled me to sample every single wine that came on the market in Yerevan, and to find out the story behind the winemakers. And one of the, as much fun as drinking the wines, was getting to know the winemakers, getting to know some of the characters about whom we're going to talk later. So that's how this concept, this book came about.
Excellent. So let's get into the book. There are several distinct yet intertwined themes in the book. Can you give a brief overview of what are kind of the main topics that you cover in the book?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Rafi. This is not like my other novels, or in fact, other novels, in the sense that there isn't one single central character and one single plot, because you cannot tell the story of revival of wine production in Armenia by just a single character and a single story. There's lots of people, lots of stories. And then I had to come with one overarching plot to combine all the pieces, which came in the form of wine fraud, which is also an important part of the wine business globally, by the way. But the first theme that hits you, and it hits you real hard, is the age of wine, how old wine production actually is. And here, I'd like to put one issue to bed right away. Wine production, most archaeological evidence points that it started somewhere in a region of the world stretching from southern Georgia all the way into Armenia, northwestern Iran, Nakhichevan, and western Armenia. in that region somewhere. Okay, there is evidence of wine production there that dates back 8,000 to 9,000 years. We talk a lot about 6,000 years only because the oldest full-fledged winery in the world was discovered in Armenia in Areni Cave, which was 6,100 years ago old. But obviously, if 6,100 years ago, these guys could have a full-fledged winery, they were producing wine before that, right? They didn't wake up one morning and first thing they did is build a winery out of thin air. So there was a winemaking tradition predating the 6,100 years. And then that winery, the full set, by the way, those of you who haven't been there, I urge you to go and visit. It's an amazing place. It's a very complex, big, it's not one cave, it's a series of caverns where they have different rooms for different wine activities and other things. So age is critical, and this is not just a historical trivia. I don't know how this worked in the case of Georgians or the ancient Persians or pre-Persian ancestors, but in the case of Armenians, wine and the fact that there was serious wine terroir even back then played a major role in shaping our genetic and cultural format. And there is quite a lot of historical and archaeological evidence to this, that the ancient Urartians, who are our pre-ancestors, had existed in the kingdom of Van before the kingdom of Van was even founded. They were there in the Van area over 5,000 years ago. They were the largest and most successful winemakers of the ancient world. And when they came to Armenia, to today's Armenia, to Vayotsor, there was no Armenia then, by the way. And as I said, wine existed before there were not only nation states that we know today, Georgia, Armenia, Iran, and so on, but before these nationalities even existed. Okay? 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, the Armenian nation wasn't born yet, and nor was the Georgian. So we can all claim that we invented wine, but wine invented us is a more accurate way of putting it than we inventing wine. So when they came, Urartians, and they came for one purpose. They were looking for new wine terroir. Terroir is a beautiful word that doesn't exist in English or in Armenian. It's French-based. It simply encompasses all the environmental, geological, all the characteristics that make a crop what it is. Climate, rainfall, days of sunshine, temperatures, humidity, soil composition, you name it, that affects a crop is part of that terroir makeup that makes it. And not every terroir is suitable for grape production for the purpose of wine. So they came, they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the terroir in Vayotsor. This is 35 years ago, or some 35,000 years ago, sorry. 35,000 years after Paul Hobbes discovered the same thing, following their footsteps. And they fell in love with it, and they stayed, and they mixed with the local population, and through that mixture came out a cultural and genetic formation of the Armenian nation. I wish there was time to do the same kind of research to see if similar stories exist in Georgia or in the Iranian side of it. One day, if I live long enough and not drink too much wine between now and then, I may take on that little research. But to me, it's fascinating. I shudder to think every time what we will uncover in terms of national histories, which they owe to the fact that they had good wine terroir and they were actually wine producers, and that different cultures and nations and races came together for the purpose of wine, and they mixed and they generated a whole new type of nationality. Now, there's one section in the book that I'd like Hallie to read next. It's this character in the book called Henry Cobb goes and sees the cave, the 6,100-year-old winery, and goes and talks to the archaeologist who was instrumental in discovering it. And the archaeologist is showing him various things, including pictures, including so. And then this is the story that it's, he stares at the picture and these are what he sees and what your emotions are. So Hallie, the first excerpt, please.
Staring at the photo, Cobb had a vision of an army of prehistoric winemaker conquerors marching into the slopes of Viator with their swords and lances and black beards and fiery eyes, looking not for opportunities to loot and plunder and rape, but for new vine terroir. He thought about how the essential quest for new wine terroir had not changed much in several thousand years. The same happened today as winemakers look for new land fit for vineyards. He felt a bond with the prehistoric vintners of Urartu, who had been on the same single-minded, purposeful odyssey as he, some 3,200 years ago. It was like feeling the presence of their ghost on his skin.
Thank you, Hallie. Now, if you listen to the name of the character, Henry Cobb, it sounds quite a lot like Paul Hobbs. So you can tell kind of where that, who that character was based on. So Paul, at that Jacobian Hobbs event in Yerevan, you recounted the first time you heard about winemaking, the story about how you first about winemaking in this region. If you could tell the audience that, that would be great.
Well, Rafi, yes. The first time really Armenia came under my radar was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I had been working as a consulting winemaker to Stag's Leap wine cellars based in Napa Valley. And the owner of the winery and the founder of the winery, Warren Yarsky, was a historian. And he had studied at the University of Chicago. I didn't know the full breadth of his studies, any of that, but he had worked at Robert Mondavi and then launched his own winery. And at some point during my work with him, he decided that he was going to retire. And well, actually, this was a few years after I left my consulting, I should say. And when he did, he threw a party for all his ex-winemakers, all those that had helped him get to where he was. And so he invited me as well, even though I'd never truly been a winemaker. I had just basically been an intellectual sounding board for him. It was a big party, a big bash. There were a number of really well-known California winemakers attending. And he did two things remarkable. At the end of this event, there was a beautiful meal, speeches, all the usual. He passed out a silver vial. And in addition to that, he had us each place our handprint into clay, which is now on display at the winery. But in the silver vial, I said, well, take that out and take a look at what's inside. And so we did. And he said, those are 2 pips from the genesis of winemaking, from Armenia, from the irony grape. And really, this was like a shock to me because I didn't know about this history. And I did my master's work at the University of California at Davis, and I had not really been made aware of that. So I kind of just put that off to the side and put it into a secretary, actually quite a beautiful place that I've kept that for all these years until this one moment occurred and Armenia came back onto my radar.
That's amazing, Paul. You know, of course, I've heard about Henry Winiarski from reading the book Judgment in Paris, about when the California wines were ahead of the French wines, all judged by French winemakers. But to kind of know that you and he had this connection around Aranis was fantastic when I first learned about that in the book. So why don't we now fast forward? Vahan and Paul talked about the origins of wine. So we're going to go fast forward now to sort of modern times, Soviet period, and especially the post-Soviet period. And I just want to echo something that Vahan had said a little bit about the state of winemaking in Armenia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. A small personal vignette here. So when my family and I first moved to Armenia in 2008, the local wine was truly undrinkable. I'll agree with Vahan. And not only that, even the wine that would be imported from France or Italy or Spain would be the poorest quality, cheapest thing you could find on the market. So really nothing you could serve when you had friends over for dinner. So every 6 months or so, I would drive up to Tbilisi and buy a couple of cases of Tsinandali and Saperavi or other Georgian wines just to have something to be able to drink. And if I think about that period 10 years ago, and where I would have truly been ashamed to serve Armenian wine to anyone, to where we are now, I mean, I now will, bring bottles with me every time I come back from Armenia. Luckily, there are now a few retailers in the U.S. where you can buy Armenian wines from. But it's been an absolute revolution. So Vahan, I'll turn it over to you. You can talk a little bit more about that and set up the next passage too.
Okay. Now, part of the way that revolution happened was the incredible influx of people into Armenia, which was not possible during Soviet times, and the impossible influx of also some Armenians to go and see the rest of the world, which was also not possible back in Soviet times. But specifically for this wine section, as you know, Rafi, one of our mutual friends, Vahe Koshkerian, came in with a vengeance to revive things. Of course, others came, and there was a lot of diaspora involvement in the rebirth of the wine industry in Armenia. Of course, the Aslanians, Armenia and Victoria came. They had roots in Armenia, but they also have a presence in the both Russian and US diaspora that when they came. Varujan Muradian of Vanardi came. He is originally from Armenia, but he had come and lived over 20 years in Los Angeles. He dropped everything, went back to Armenia, started a vineyard and a winery. There were others. There were some of the locals too, like let's not forget, Zori Garibian, one of whose wines we will feature later on, the Zora. He came from Italy. And he, with this incredible, these guys didn't do this coordinated way, okay? They all came with a vision to come and revive, to restart wine production in Armenia. And there were, of course, the locals. One of my favorites, Hovagim, is a kind of a philosopher, poet, musician, Hovagim Sagatelian, who produces the Trinity, which we're also going to feature today. He was from Armenia, and the Manaserians of Tushpa are from Armenia in Ararat Valley and so on. So it was an incredible mixture of both very strong diaspora involvement and some old traditional local Armenian wine producers. But this mixture wasn't just in the narrow community of winemakers. This was nationwide. And nationwide, it created in some cases certain cultural clashes. Okay. There were Armenians coming from the Middle East, Russian-based culture, which is prevalent. There is some of leftover old Soviet culture that was prevalent in certain corners. There were the repats from Europe versus those from the Middle East and so on. And there were the old Yerevansis, the originals, which are the minority now in Yerevan versus the new, and there are the new generation of young technocrats, for example, which don't really relate much for the older generation. Anyway, there was this incredible mixture of cultures and sometimes clashes of cultures. And one of the main cultural clashes that existed was between the Russian-based way of thinking, or the I shouldn't say just Soviet, because there's also Russian without being Soviet-based cultural legacy, and then the diaspora who had never been exposed to the Russian or Soviet-based cultural way of thinking and their way of thinking. And one of the winemakers, I tried to bring this into the book. One of the winemakers from the diaspora comes and encounters this Russian presence all the time and gets really angry. And that's the one part of Armenia to which he is very strongly attracted to. That's the one part that he cannot deal with. I bet you this existed also in other Soviet republics, post-Soviet republics. I bet maybe not. The rest didn't have as big a diaspora as we do, but there was this clash between the pre-Soviet or Soviet and the post-Soviet. So one of the characters thinks that, okay, we have a 4,500-year-old history, and only the last 70 years was Soviet. So there's so much that is not that. So I will stick with the part that has survived from the pre-Soviet influence and ignore the rest, that kind of thing. And this is a great conversation, which I'd like Hallie to read next. He's having this conversation with his lawyer. His lawyer is asking him, why are you so stuck up on the Russians? Forget it, stick with Armenia. And then go ahead, Hallie. The first sentence is what the lawyer asks, and then this guy's response.
And enough of the pre-Soviet culture has survived to make you feel like you belong? Of course, my friend. Haig lost his sober mood and reverted to his jovial self. The history has survived. No foreign occupying empire could take our history from us, and I own the history. Traditions, the language, the music, the poetry, the stories have survived. I own them too, especially the stories. The stubborn, unyielding survival instinct has survived, and I sure own that. Haig's laugh bellowed down the balcony and echoed into the park. Let's not forget the big donkey in the stable. The all-important terroir has survived. The Soviets turned everyone's life upside down, but they couldn't change geography. Neither Marx, nor Lenin, nor Stalin could take away our terroir. His roaring laugh returned to fill the night.
That is so true. They couldn't change the terroir. No one could have changed the terroir. Rafi.
So, speaking of terroir, Vahan, there are a number of references to microclimates in various parts of Armenia, and especially in Vayotzor, and to a number of indigenous grapes. I mean, one of the neat things about the book is that each chapter begins with a description of indigenous grape varietal in Armenia. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the diversity of indigenous grapes and the different regions of Armenia.
Since it all started in this region, both Georgia and Armenia have a very rich legacy of very ancient indigenous grapes. And we're going to cover some of them today. We're going to present you some of them through the wines that we're tasting. But not only are these indigenous grapes interesting, but also the territory, the terroir that we're talking about has so many microclimates. You know, the same grape, like let's say Voskehad in Vayotzor, has a different characteristic than Voskehad in Arakadzoden, in Norietesia, let's say, where the Armaz winery is. That's how much difference there is between these microclimates and the various terroirs, various indigenous grapes that exist. I have a personal peeve here, which I'd like to throw on the table, that I am partial to the indigenous grapes rather than to the hybrid grapes. We also have hybrid grapes. Hybrid meaning grapes that were invented in the Soviet times, in the 70s mostly, through the Research Institute for Viticulture and Winemaking in the Soviet Union. Now, what I'm going to say, again, is not a testimony of the wine. In fact, at the last Zoom meeting, I featured a wine which was 100% Hachtanag of Tushpa, which is an excellent wine, but its Hachtanag is a hybrid grape. And today, we're going to feature an excellent rosé, which is 100% made of Garmrahut. And Garmrahut also is a hybrid grape. It's not an indigenous grape. But there's something more than just being able to produce good wine. And there's a philosophical issue for me that with such a small territory as Armenia, if I had a vineyard today full of Hachtanag and Garmrahut and Gankun, which is a white hybrid grape, I would rip them all off, throw them away, and plant indigenous grapes and some foreign, why not foreign grapes? I would plant Syrah, I would plant Petit Syrah, maybe Grenache, and so on, and see what kind of blends I can come up with the indigenous Armenian grapes and these foreign grapes or the Bordeaux style grapes. So, having said that, we have hundreds of indigenous and very old Armenian grapes that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Of course, you could plant them, just like grapes and vines are movable. If they like the environment somewhere, if they like the terroir, you could spread them. But these are originated there, they were domesticated there, and they have survived for over 6,000 years. Some of these grapes that we're talking about, especially the RNE in that cave, when they discovered the clay equipment, let me say, there were residues of skin, seeds, and stems, and the genetic test shows that it's basically today's RNE, genetically, it's the same as today's RNE. So these grapes have survived over 6,000, maybe much more years, genetically the same without changing. So I think that's a wealth. I think that's a national treasure which we should hold on to. I think it's very important, not just for wine drinkers, but in general as a cultural issue. Now, one of my favorite places on earth, and one, it just so happens, it's also the epicenter of wine grape production in Armenia, happens to be Vayotzor. That's where the Urardians came and couldn't believe their eyes and stayed and mixed with the local population. And that's where winemakers much later came and couldn't believe their eyes, even after checking a few other regions like Armavir and Tavush. And when they came to Vayotzor, they couldn't believe their eyes and they stayed. The next excerpt Hallie is going to read is about that. It's about what Vayotzor does to even first-time visitor.
He told me there was only one other place on earth where he had an out-of-body experience like that, Haig said. The Perito Moreno glaciers in Argentina near El Calafate. He got the same feeling in Vayotzor. He mentioned the snow-capped mountains, vast meadows and valleys, rolling hills at over 4,000 feet above sea level, skies that seemed more boundless than anywhere else on earth, air more fertile and pregnant than anywhere else. You know how the region gets in the spring? Full of life, brilliant colors everywhere, sensuality everywhere, every living thing from insects to birds to animals to plants preoccupied by procreation. The magic of Vayotzor had struck him. I was shocked.
Wow, that's beautiful. And Vahan, we forgot to mention that your backdrop, kind of the virtual background in your Zoom thing, is actually a view from your place in Vartahovid in Vayotzor. So what you see are the actual mountains that are being spoken about in these passages.
This is a view from my bedroom window.
And now I haven't seen it from your bedroom window, but I've been on the terrace and seen it several times. It truly is magical. Paul, maybe since these were, again, paraphrasing you, maybe you could give a couple of, kind of enrich the story a little bit here.
Well, first of all, I should say that through the connection made purely through two gentlemen, Vahe and Beacon Yakubian, who live in the Glendale area, contacted me to take a trip. And I guess they knew they had read something about my background. They were very interested in doing something in Armenia. And that's when that whole thing with Winarski came together as well. So it all kind of tied together and said, well, this place has really incredible historical significance. Let's go. Not an easy place to get to. And they said, hey, we'll explore any of the country you want to see. So we did travel north of Lake Sevan. In fact, there was one point where they cautioned me not to get too close to the Azerbaijan border for fear of maybe the guard got nervous on the other side and start waving his gun. But we were out in the raw with the shovels, digging around, studying the soil. It was really an exceptional place. We went to some places where they were also renovating some of the churches or the ancient Christian churches there. Beautiful. But when we finally came to Vayotzor, that description that was just read captivated me, and it did bring me to the Perito Moreno Glacier. It's stunning and it's otherworldly. There's no other, I mean, it sent a chill up my spine. In fact, in some ways, I kind of felt like I was reading or in the book of Tolkien's The Hobbit and the trilogy.
Wow.
Just some of the descriptions, or just some of the feeling with the mountains in the background, the whole setting, and the naturalness of the place. You know, this whole idea of biodynamic farming, these guys have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years. And we met with some of the local people, and their faces reminded me almost something out of a Steven Spielberg movie. They were so genuine and so kind. And there was at one moment we went into one of their homes, and I remember with the Viken and Vahe, and we were offered the wine he was making, and they had just suffered an incredible hailstorm. But they welcomed us into their home. They had fresh cheese. natural products they had just made. And I remember Vegan saying, "Hey, Paul, do you think this is safe to eat?" And then the guy we went down into his cellar, and he had a hole in the ground where he cooked some of his meats and so on. And he had some jugs of wine, and they were like had a film growing over the top of them. And he asked me to try them. Then the Vegan turned to me again, and he said, "This is safe to drink." The wine was quite good, actually. A little bit oxidized, a little bit of vinegar in there as well. And then he said, "Hey, I'd like anything you can tell me to make my wine better. I'm open." It was that kind of experience.
That's fantastic.
Rafi, I have one comment about Paul. Okay, Paul, I don't know if you know this, but there are two very specific similarities between you and the ancient Urartians. And I'm not just making theoretical, generalized statements, very, very concrete. First, you go around the world known to you today, just like they did in the world known to them 3,000, 4,000 years ago, taking your winemaking expertise and your marketing branding expertise, and you look for new terroir and new, that's why you weren't happy just with California. You went to Argentina, to Armenia, to Spain, to France, and so on, looking for new wine terroir. That's exactly what they did 4,000 years ago, the Urartians. Yeah. Second thing in common, you went there to Vayotsor and fell in love. They came to Vayotsor 3,500 years before you and fell in love. Now, I get chills. You know, I looking at this similarity across 3-4 millennia of experiences. God knows what we're missing here, what else has happened that we're missing in that whole region. But anyway, this thing struck me when I was looking at some of these experiences and the quotes and so on. I said, you know, that's exactly what they did back then. Anyway, sorry, Rafi, to interrupt, but I had to throw that in.
Not at all. Actually, you set up the next question yourself, Vahan. You know, I think, you know, one of the themes is this connection between specific grape varietals and wine and human emotions. And you've sort of taken that to the next level of detail in terms of specific grape varietals and emotions. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well. And you know, you and I have had a lot of long conversations about, you know, the validity of this theory.
This is something very near and dear to my heart. Now, and the initial idea came to me when I was studying with a wonderful man in Armenia called Boris Kasparyan. I don't know if you guys know him. He is the archaeologist that is responsible partly for discovering the RNA1K, but many, many other discoveries. He knows more about the ancient world than anybody else I know. Anyway, he explained to me that back 4,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago, 61, in that cave, wine wasn't just a drink. Don't imagine a bunch of cavemen, winos, sitting outside their cave with a fire and getting drunk. If you imagine that, you're totally off. Okay? These guys took wine very seriously. Wine was a religion for them. And if wine was a religion, they actually worshipped wine. And the next excerpt Hallie is going to read is about that. But before she starts, I figured if wine is a religion and they worship and they have ceremonies and they take it so seriously, they must have had a very strong spiritual context to consuming wine. And if there was a spiritual context, they couldn't have missed the impact or the relationship with the wine and their emotions. Where do you draw the line between human spirituality and emotional state? I mean, so I figured these guys 6,100 years ago must have understood that there is some connection between their emotional state and this wine that they're drinking, which they thought was the blood of God. And okay, I was building this theory in my mind, and then while doing the research of the book, I came across an incredible experiment that they had done much more recently in Italy, where they take a human subject, put them in an MRI machine, they monitor their brain, and they inject wine from a tube into their mouth, red wine, white wine, water, and they monitor the brain activity through the MRI machine. Now, two very strong outcomes came out of this. Number one, that the brain cells of sommeliers who were trained to detect flavors and aromas and bouquets lit up much more than the brains of someone who had absolutely no training in tasting wine. And I'm going to come back to that later when we start the tasting. I'm going to talk about the importance of that kind of training. But second, even more interesting for me was all of a sudden I discovered that the part of the brain that lights up when the wine hits the tongue isn't just the general thing, but it is the anterior part of the insular cortex, which is responsible for human emotions. That's responsible, that part of the brain, which is responsible for us to feel happiness, sorrow, anger, all these things light up big time when you inject, when that wine touches the tongue. So I put the two together, 100-year-old conjecture, basically about spirituality and tie with emotions versus modern day actual scientific experiment. I said there has to be a connection. And then I came up with this elaborate theory of there are some wines that you enjoy with friends and parties. Some wines are there in a celebratory way to celebrate. When you're in a mood to celebrate, you drink a certain kind of wine. When you're in the mood to contemplate, to reflect, you drink actually a totally different wine. The wine that will help you celebrate will annoy you if you want to be in a reflective and meditative mood. It's too noisy, it's too playful, it's too young, it's just not the right wine for that mood that you're in. So I have over 20 different moods and emotions, detailed very nuanced human emotions in the book, and the different wines that they should be paired with. You shouldn't, and there is this incredible character, Vahan, who he has a wine club, and he goes around watching people, and one of his superpowers is the ability to detect their moods. He can tell whether somebody is in a happy, lighthearted mood, or someone is a more sad mood, or something ending there, or he's deeply in nostalgia of somebody, he's missing somebody so bad. And he checks which wine he's drinking, and he gets really mad when they're drinking the wrong wine for that particular mood. Anyway, this is all runs throughout the book. Now, but let's go back to Halley and to the initial the initial kind of inspiration of where this idea kind of sprung in my head. And that goes back 6,100 years. Halley.
I'll just add a little note that I wish I could give justice to the amazing voice that Boris has. I read this passage. I heard the story straight from his mouth inside the cave on one of my first trips to Armenia, and it was an incredible experience. For them, the grape, saturated as it was with the sun, was divine. Several millennia later, Galileo Galilei would say, wine is sunlight held together by water. These folks knew that some 5,500 years before Galileo. For them, grape juice was the blood of God. Drinking wine meant ingesting part of God, becoming part of God. Then, 4,000 years later, Christianity would adopt the same concept and bring it into the practice of communion. This is my blood, says Christ, passing a cup of wine to his disciples. But these folks went further. In their relentless quest for ways to bring man and God closer, they made human sacrifices, mixed human blood with divine blood, and drank the mixture. More than 6,000 years ago, wine was not just something you twirled, sniffed, tasted, and paired with food. It was a religion. It defined these people and their lives. It embodied the meaning of life. They had more faith in it than the vast majority of people today have faith in whatever God they choose to worship. The scene sent a chill through Isabel. She envisioned Kashvili as the all-knowing, all-powerful high priest. The tip of his long, pointed beard reached his waist, his black robes purposefully swaying with his movements, and his fiery eyes exuded such intense charisma and magnetism that his sacrificial subjects submitted their throats to him voluntarily.
There you go.
Wow.
It was a religion.
Vahan,
Anyway.
I stand corrected. I stand corrected.